مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يركز الأمريكيون على الأجواء المسرحية لحملة انتخاباتنا الرئاسية، ولكن العالم لا يقبل في انتظار النتيجة، فالبلدان حول العالم تعود الأداء بالفعل لنهاية ولاية أوباما وبداية رئاسة جديدة. في بعض الحالات يأمل الخصوم أن يحرموا الرئيس الجديد من الخيارات وبدائل، وربما يفسر ذلك الحق روسيا في ضغط لاستيلاء الحلب مثلا. وفي حالة أخرى يأمل الحلفاء أن يعيد الرئيس الجديد التفكير في السياسات الحالية ويغير المسار. هذا على الأرجح ما يسيطر على التفكير في أماكن متباينة مثل الرياض والقدس. ولكن بعد 8 أعوام من الرئيس أوباما تتساءل البلدان حول العالم أما إذا كانت شعارات الحملة ستترجم إلى سياسة حقيقية. لمناقشة كيف يستعد العالم للرئيس القادم، يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس وجيمي كيرتشيك. And welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. So our guests today are Jamie Kirchick and Dennis Ross. So let's start with a country we wouldn't normally have started with for the last 20 years, but the new big player again on the block, Russia. What is Russia already doing to define itself for the incoming president? Dennis.
What you really see, I think, in Syria is very much an anticipation that the next administration is going to be much tougher on them than the current one is, much less likely to be self-deterred. And therefore, what I think Putin is trying to do is to create a new reality within Syria. So the new administration confronts a circumstance where Aleppo has either been depopulated or has been retaken by the Syrian regime. And so the potential for Russia to be in a stronger position to then try to dictate the terms of any political approach will certainly be part of this. Now, the fact that I emphasize depopulation isn't an accident. I think Putin would like to see more refugees coming out of Syria because it puts more pressure on Europe. Putting more pressure on Europe makes him the go-to person. Okay, you want me to help solve your problem? Lift the sanctions on Ukraine. So I see in Putin's case a very deliberate effort to position himself in an anticipation that what he may see as a window of opportunity begins to close once the next administration comes in, and he's trying to gain as much as he can in this period of time.
So, Jamie, you spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe. What's your lens for understanding what the Russians are doing?
Well, yeah, they're certainly trying to get away with, I think, as much as they can. But I certainly think that he would be given much more leeway. The Russians would be given much more leeway in Central and Eastern Europe to continue the sorts of political subversion, gas line, pipeline politics, shutoffs that they've been doing for the past, 15 years.
So, just first on the political level, do either of you think there'll be a legacy of this clandestine Russian hacking, election manipulation? I mean, how does that figure into high politics between Moscow and Washington after an election? What do you think?
I mean, it's incredible because having traveled in this region, these are the sorts of tactics that you saw in Ukraine, you see them in the Baltic states, you see them in the Czech Republic. The notion that the Russians would actually be trying to subvert our democracy in ways that they've only limited those tactics to the former Soviet space is really remarkable. I mean, this is not something that they even did during the Cold War. I think the most involvement they ever did was probably, supporting Henry Wallace when he ran as a third-party candidate in 1948. But now we have actual, real involvement, and I think this is something, finally you saw the administration come out and acknowledge this. They had kind of been sitting on this information for months. And now the question is, Barack Obama has 4 months left in his presidency. How is he going to respond? Is he going to launch some sort of cyber response? I mean, I think that's a really important question.
What do you think, Dennis? What does either the sitting president or the new president do about this?
I think that the new president will basically, very early on, perhaps even during the transition, some messages will be sent directly to Putin, saying you're playing with fire. And if you think that we'll be self-deterred, or you think that because we're concerned about what the nature of the response that you might take may be, think again, we can do things that makes life much more difficult for you. So I do think there'll be an effort to sort of communicate to him. And look, one thing about Putin, Putin is not this wild risk taker. You don't engage in hybrid wars. You don't use little green men if you're prepared to go and always be provocative. He tests the waters. So my guess is he'll heed what he hears, and he'll become more careful in terms of how he responds.
In fact, if you recall during the first debate, Hillary Clinton said some lines sort of alluding to the fact that the United States has much stronger cyber capabilities than the Russians did. It was sort of a vague threat almost.
Yeah. All right, so let's move from this level to the strategic level. There seems to be a race going on. The Russians to take Aleppo and the Americans to take Mosul before the change of new president coming in January. How would these important developments on the ground in the Middle East, how would they change the balance, and how would they set a different table, as it were, for the incoming president? Dennis?
Look, it's a really interesting question. In a sense, each of us having taken, let's say, Aleppo or Mosul, may find it doesn't produce as much as we actually want. In our case, if Mosul is liberated, but the key Shia militias have ended up playing a role in it, and these militias are the ones that are heavily influenced by the Iranians and actually have Revolutionary Guard al-Quds Force advisors with them. If the pattern of the past is repeated, where suddenly a lot of the young Sunni males disappear, then you're setting the stage for what is going to be a very difficult set of circumstances afterwards. If we don't have a strategy to deal with that, we're going to face sooner or later a son of ISIS. And I think the new administration is going to confront a situation in Mosul that is very challenging. It's going to put a premium on trying to figure out a way to reconstruct. It's going to put a premium on trying to figure out a way to come up with different approaches to sharing power in Iraq. On the Russian side, okay, so let's say you've depopulated Aleppo. So what you've gained is you've gained Aleppo, and you've gained the potential to partition Syria, which is probably what Putin wants. The problem is, once you partition Syria, you also face a problem out there. The conflict's not going to go away. And if you've contributed to creating Somalia in the rest of Syria, that may not be such a great thing for the Russians. It certainly won't be a great thing for us either. So there is a need to sort of figure out what you do in the rest of Syria. There's also, I think, a need for us to also think through how you could raise the cost to Putin, or at least to make it very clear, look, if you don't play by a common set of rules here within Syria, we will raise the price to you. Up until now, the Obama administration has deliberately not done that. Don't count on the next administration to adopt the same posture unless you're prepared to change your behavior.
Jamie, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I agree with Dennis to the extent, but he didn't really talk about Iran, and I think the reason why we haven't done anything in Syria, and we've basically allowed this bloodshed to go on for 5 or 6 years now, is because the president has a deal with Iran that is this is the centerpiece of his entire foreign policy, regional strategy, and he does not want to do anything that would disrupt that. And so basically allowing the Iranians to have Syria as part of their backyard and their ally Assad in power, and to do what he wants, that's come as a cost of the Iran deal. And you won't hear the people in the administration say this explicitly, but I think if you look at the policy over the past 5 or 6 years, which has basically just been allowing this to go on with a couple of guns being sent to a few rebel groups, but no real strategy to actually get rid of the Assad regime. I think this is a cost of the Iran deal. And Hillary Clinton played a role in the beginnings of that Iran deal. She wasn't really there at the negotiating table for most of it. Whether or not she's going to reverse that policy, I think, is really an open question.
And do you think that events between now and January may set it up so that there will be a shift in American policy here?
I don't see anything happening in the next 3 months that would be so decisive. But if the Syria crisis continues to go on, and you have these massive refugee flows going into Europe, which I should add are really affecting the domestic politics of Europe. you are seeing a rise in far-right, radical, populist parties across the continent. I think it played a role in the Brexit vote. In Germany, we're seeing a far-right party stronger and more popular than anything since World War II. In France, you have Marine Le Pen and the National Front. This is being replicated all over Europe. And it just so happens that all these parties tend to be pro-Moscow. So that's another benefit for the Russians. So this could be a real geopolitical catastrophe affecting our Europe policy if we don't put an end to it.
Dennis, do you agree with this basic analysis?
I do think that the administration has been very hesitant to do things in Syria against Assad because they feared first they feared that it would make it more difficult to negotiate the nuclear deal, and later they have feared that somehow it would give the Iranians an excuse to walk away from the deal. And I think the basic analysis is wrong. The Iranians didn't do the deal as a favor to us. They did the deal to end the sanctions. And they don't really have an interest in walking away from the deal, certainly in any kind of dramatic way, because sanctions are suspended for 8 years, meaning another 7 years. They're not terminated. The real danger point in terms of when they decide they no longer have an interest in the deal is after the sanctions have actually been terminated. Then their stake in living up to it, I think, goes down dramatically. So I think there's been a kind of false premise here in terms of what the administration feared. And I do not see, if Secretary Clinton becomes President Clinton, I don't see her walking away from the deal because we're not the only party to this deal. But I do think her instinct will be to hold the Iranian feet much more to the fire, and I think she'll be much less reluctant to be prepared to compete with them in the region in a way that the Obama administration, I think, has been very hesitant.
Okay, when we come back after this break, we're going to ask about any other challengers and what they're doing around the world, and then also what our allies hope for from the new president in just a moment. Again, our panel of foreign policy experts includes James Kirchick. Jamie is a journalist and foreign correspondent, currently based here in Washington. So far in his career, he has reported from Southern Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, across the European continent, and the Caucasus. There's not much left. He is currently a fellow with the Foreign Policy Initiative, a correspondent for the Daily Beast, and he writes the Continental Drift column on Europe for Tablet. For over 3 years, he worked at the New Republic, where he covered domestic politics, lobbying, intelligence, and American foreign policy. Then he moved to Prague to become writer-at-large for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where he wrote about the politics and cultures of the 21 countries in that station's broadcast region. Born and raised in Boston, he is a graduate of Yale. Dennis Ross is my colleague and the counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In President Obama's first term, he spent 3 years in the administration, in the State Department advising Hillary Clinton, and then at the White House as senior director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. Dennis has 25 years' experience at high levels in government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. So, gentlemen, let's look around the globe quickly. Other sort of bad actors, Venezuela, North Korea, China, are they trying to do anything to set the table for the new president? Are they trying to prepare it to be a welcoming table, or are they putting down markers about you better watch out? Jamie?
I haven't seen the same degree of sort of brinksmanship among the countries that you just mentioned as we have with the Russians. I think the Chinese are much more conservative power. They think a lot more into the future. They're not spoilers in the way that the Russians are. I mean, the Russians are really behaving just outrageously with what they're doing in our own domestic political situation. And while the Chinese had their own hacks of the Office of Personnel Management, it's hard to see China doing this the same extent. I mean, they are very heavily invested in our country. The United States is very heavily invested in China. And the same doesn't exist for Russia. I think it's only about 1% of Russia's trade is with the United States. So they feel that they can get away with this, and they're not I would say, as long-term strategic thinkers as the Chinese are.
Interesting. Dennis?
Yeah, I basically agree with that. And I also think in the case of Venezuela, they're so consumed by what's going on inside that they don't really have the bandwidth to be thinking and doing more vis-a-vis us. In the case of North Korea, it's not our election that is affecting their leader. Their leader, I think, is consumed by thinking that he has to make himself a factor on the international stage, and the nuclear capability is what does it. And he knows the Chinese basically are going to limit what they're going to do against him because they fear, his collapse. He has what I've always referred to as the power of the weak. He'll threaten to collapse, and that's what they're most afraid of. So it really does come back to the Russians, and also, in a sense, to who Putin is. Putin has taken the measure, I think, of President Obama and realizes there are things that he can do, and it's his style. I mean, he was trained as a KGB operative. This kind of subterfuge is something that he's always done. What's new and different is that he does it towards us. And at some point, he made a judgment that he could do it, and there wouldn't be any consequence for doing it. And therefore, why not take advantage of it for as long as he can? And I would say there's one other thing. He's always had within him a strong impulse towards payback towards us. He resents how he feels we acted when we were the kind of unipolar power, and he feels we exploited Russian weakness, and this is his opportunity to get back at what he sees as an American weakness.
All right, let's turn to our allies, both our traditional allies in Europe and our friends around the globe. What are they doing to prepare the table for the new president? Are they already projecting hopes, anxieties, a wish list perhaps? Jamie, what do you say?
Well, it's actually unprecedented the degree to which some European leaders have said openly negative things about Donald Trump. And normally you don't see foreign leaders commenting on domestic politics in the United States because they obviously want to hedge their bets and they want to be prepared. But I mean, you had the foreign minister of Germany, for instance, a couple months ago called Donald Trump a hate preacher. And this has been replicated across Europe. But I have to tell you, talking to European diplomats, they have absolutely no clue what is going to happen with the Trump administration. And I honestly can't give them much advice. I mean, they're asking, who would he appoint as the Undersecretary of State for this or that? And there's no real indications.
Mm-hmm. Dennis, our allies.
They are petrified. It's true. Look, to be fair, we've never seen a candidate like Trump, so maybe it's not so surprising that we see many of our allies coming out publicly and not being able to hide what they feel. It is really unprecedented. Now, the fact that he will say something like, if the Baltic states are attacked, will he come to their aid? Well, it depends on what their contributions are. So the fact that he has raised basic questions about whether he would be there for allies, it shouldn't be all that surprising that, in fact, they're making it pretty clear they would prefer to see somebody else.
To take a country like Egypt, which just before our election announces it's going to do military exercises with Russia.
Yeah.
This is a long, close, traditional ally. What message are they trying to send to our new president?
Well, I think what they're trying to say is that, the last few years with the United States have left us feeling that we've been more of a friend of the United States than they have been to us. And the Russians are acting like a power in this region, and we can't afford to ignore that. So I think it's both a message along those lines, but it's also designed to send a message to suggest, look, we've had a strategic relationship with you, but if you're not going to respect that strategic relationship and you're going to, in a sense, withhold what were important security forms of support for us at a time when we critically needed it, we can move in different directions, and they hope that that will increase the American incentive to be more responsive to them.
Well, what do countries around the globe do to get the attention of a new president? I mean, here it is, a new page, and you're not an A-list country. What do you do?
I think you can offer things to be helpful. I think, particularly in the Middle East where we're having so many problems, I think there are ways that, a country like Egypt, a country like Israel could, try to not be a problem, to propose things that would maybe keep them out of the headlines. For instance, if you're a country like Georgia, where 20% of your territory is occupied by the Russians, you might not want to start off the next administration with a crisis or try to provoke some sort of crisis. You might want to just kind of try to lay low.
All right, let me ask you about the dynamic between outgoing president and incoming president, just in the aftermath of an election. I mean, we have a transition process, which in our country is extremely long. Used to be longer, but 3 months is still a significant period of time. How does this dynamic work just on foreign policy? At what point does the incoming president take into account the views of the outgoing president? Dennis?
You know, it very much depends upon who the president is. George H.W. Bush had a strong sense of propriety. And even though he was the sitting vice president, as president-elect, he would constantly say, we have one administration at a time, but we stay out of it completely.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الأثر الاستراتيجي لسقوط حلب، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alkhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.